In the second half of the 19th century, Germany transitioned from a predominantly rural society reliant on agriculture and artisanal trade to an urbanized industrial powerhouse. At the time of German unification in 1871, Germany was already one of the most industrialized countries of the world, just behind Britain, the US and France, and over the following decades it would only further rise up the ranks. Key economic sectors such as mining, construction, metallurgy and chemistry were subjected to a never-before-seen process of capitalization and commodification, and with the ascent of new technologies, the efficiency of these industries only grew further. As a result of this, areas like the Ruhr Valley, Silesia, Saxony and the Saarland became some of the most prosperous regions in all of Europe. More and more people were employed in factories, and they flocked to industrial cities like Berlin, Frankfurt and Hamburg in the hopes of finding employment and a better life. Although factory work was preferable to a life of poverty in the countryside, most workers faced harsh conditions and were ruthlessly exploited by local capitalists. In 1871, the average working week was roughly 72 hours, and by 1913 it was still 55.5 hours. Oftentimes, work conditions were extremely dangerous, and accident rates were high in both mines and factories. Many workers lived in rental barracks, which were cheaply erected 4 or 5-story tenement buildings, designed in such a way that as many people as possible might be crammed into them. Some famous examples of this are the quarters of Wedding and Neukölln in Berlin and the Gängeviertel in Hamburg. Families were often crammed into small rooms with barely any sunlight, and it was not unusual for family members to share one single bed. Nevertheless, rent was still extortionately high. Living conditions were definitely better in company housing estates, but the residents were often subjected to harsh disciplinary codes and random checkups. Another catch was that workers became practically reliant on their employer, as they would lose their flat as soon as they stopped working for him. For most workers, the wages were barely enough to exist upon, and after the introduction of tariffs on agricultural products in 1879, food became ever more expensive. Despite the fact that all workers suffered from harsh exploitation and unfair economic and social conditions, the growing working class was far from homogeneous and remained deeply divided. For example, German workers often looked down on Polish agricultural laborers in eastern Prussia, and many foundry workers, fitters and turners working in heavy industry saw themselves as more valuable and skilled than simple factory workers. Employers often took advantage of this internal division by separating between core workers who were seen as vital and often granted special privileges and better housing, and marginal workers on the other hand who could be fired and replaced spontaneously. The relatively young workers' movement made it its primary goal to unite all of these workers in order to create a fairer and better society. Due to the explosive nature and importance of the social question and the conflict between the owning and working class, Germany actually became one of the first countries in which organized socialist labor movements were created. The first of them was the General German Workers' Association, founded in 1863 by Ferdinand Lassalle. 6 years later, the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany was founded in Eisenach, and it was headed by Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel. While both of these socialist parties sought to change the system, they were in bitter rivalry with each other. Both parties had differing interpretations of socialist theory, opinions on trade unions, and relations to the state and answers to the German question. This would only change after German unification. For one, the German question had definitively been resolved in favor of the lesser German solution. Furthermore, both parties faced persecution from the state and the police, and the financial crash of 1873 further exacerbated the social problems. And so, in 1875, during a party congress in Gotha, both parties merged together to form the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. The Gotha program, which was formulated at the congress, was radical. The party made it very clear that they wanted to transform Germany into a direct democracy in which the citizens enjoyed full civil liberties and stronger workers' protection rights. It says, "Proceeding from this principle, the Socialist Labour Party of Germany seeks through all legal means the free state and the socialist society, the destruction of the iron laws of wages, the overthrow of exploitation in all forms, and the abolition of all social and political inequality." What's important to stress is that the party was not revolutionary, anarchist or conspiratorial, but reformist. It wanted to use the general, equal and free voting rights which all German men enjoyed, and the parliament to accomplish their goals. The socialists swiftly grew in popularity, and the Socialist Workers' Party became increasingly dynamic and confident. In the elections of 1877, it gained 9.1% of the votes and 12 seats in parliament. In industrialized Saxony, 38% voted for them, and in Berlin that number was as high as 39%. Thousands of people joined the party, and by 1876 it had attracted 38,000 members. From the outset, the relationship between the workers' movement and the German state was marked by repression and prohibition. August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht were detained at a fortress in Lötzen in 1870 after publicly protesting against the Franco-Prussian War and the subsequent annexation of Alsace-Lorraine. After intense public outrage, both of them were released. In May 1871, however, Bebel showed solidarity with the Paris Commune, which was an unprecedented provocation against the German Bürgertum, the bourgeoisie. Bebel and Liebknecht were once again arrested and accused of high treason against the fatherland. In the so-called Leipzig High Treason Trial of 1872, both were found guilty and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Interestingly, however, the trial was a victory for the socialists, as their passionate defense gained them a lot of sympathy among the working class, and because Bebel and Liebknecht could stylize themselves as martyrs. Furthermore, the authorities made the mistake of using the Communist Manifesto as evidence to demonstrate the subversive and revolutionary attitude of the workers' movement. Until then, the Communist Manifesto had been forbidden and relatively unknown, but now the pamphlet could be reprinted as documentation of the trial and distributed all over the country. In this sort of environment, it is remarkable that the workers' movement managed to grow so quickly. After all, the German Empire was an autocratic federal state, dominated by Prussian aristocrats and landowners who were determined to preserve the hegemony of the industrialists as well as the agrarian capitalists. Despite the admittedly progressive voting system for the imperial parliament, the common people had very little political influence. The man whose task it was to make sure that the status quo was preserved was Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of the Kaiserreich and the architect of German unification. Like most other conservatives in the country, Bismarck was highly suspicious of any social revolutionary movement, be it communism, socialism, anarchism, or social democracy. To him, all of these ideas would inevitably lead to revolution, as they questioned the existing social order between the state and its people. To him, the power of the aristocracy was the natural law of order. Bismarck may not have believed in a social democratic mass movement, nor did he fear that the socialists would ever gain a parliamentary majority, but he still feared the spread of revolutionary ideas. During the economic depression of the 1870s, the topic of social democracy became ever more present as major cities and industrial regions became hotbeds for the socialist movement. For the Chancellor, this was a worrying development, and he even went so far as to blame the Social Democrats for the financial crisis, which was in fact caused by stock market speculation and an excess of goods on the world market. As long as socialist aspirations maintain their threatening level, confidence will not return at home for fear of further developments, and therefore unemployment will continue as long as democracy threatens us. Overall, Bismarck paid little attention to the events in Gotha and the merger of the two socialist parties. He had bigger concerns to deal with, such as foreign policy and the ongoing economic crisis. What is more, any attempt to introduce harsh measures against the Socialist Workers' Party was met with resistance. In 1875, the Prussian Interior Minister, Friedrich zu Eulenburg, demanded a tightening of criminal law so that anyone who publicly incites different classes of the population against each other in a way that jeopardizes public peace, or who publicly attacks the institutions of marriage, the family, or property in the same way by speech or writing, could be punished with imprisonment. The two largest parties in the Reichstag, the National Liberal and the Centre Party, could not agree to this. The Liberals argued that the proposal was formulated too vaguely and that it might lead to a rule of arbitrariness which they themselves might fall victim to. The Catholics, meanwhile, wanted to stand up to Bismarck, who had been waging a Kulturkampf, a cultural struggle, against the Catholic Church for several years now. The opportunity to take action against social democracy only came a few years later. On the 11th of May, 1878, the 20-year-old tinsmith Max Hödel fired 2 shots at Kaiser Wilhelm I as he passed through unter den Linden Boulevard. Hödel had been excluded from the Socialist Workers' Party the month prior and had later joined the anti-Semitic Christian Social Party. Despite the fact that nobody got hurt in the attack, Bismarck used it as a pretext to formulate an emergency law against social democracy. But due to its vague and hasty formulation, it got rejected by the Reichstag. Just 1 week later, a certain Karl Eduard Nobiling carried out an assassination attempt and managed to seriously injure the Kaiser, who was once again passing through unter den Linden. Despite the failure of the authorities to prove any association between Nobiling and the Social Democrats, Bismarck seized the opportunity to dissolve the Reichstag and to call for new elections. Only afterwards did he inquire about the Kaiser's well-being. Due to the agitated mood that prevailed in Germany after the assassination, the composition of the Reichstag changed significantly. The Liberals lost 29 seats, while the two conservative parties were the only ones that managed to increase their share in votes. Considering these circumstances, the Socialist Workers' Party did relatively well in the elections, and they still retained 9 seats in total. Under pressure from the anti-socialist mood and faced with the bad election results, the Liberals began to abandon their fundamental opposition to an emergency law to curb social democracy. After the elections were over, Bismarck launched an unprecedented verbal assault on the Social Democrats. Full of contempt, he called them murderers and arsonists, stating, "The annual growth of the threatening band of robbers with whom we share our largest cities enforces the solidarity of self-defense. The state should show no mercy and wage a ruthless war of extermination." According to him, the Social Democrats were at war with the state, and they were to be treated just like under martial law. Bismarck even went so far as to completely deny them their humanity, stating, "They are the rats of the land and should be exterminated." In October 1878, the so-called Law Against the Public Danger of Social Democratic Endeavours was passed in the Reichstag with the support of the conservative parties and the National Liberals. The Social Democrats, the Left Liberal Progress Party, the Catholic Centre Party, and the representatives of the Polish and French minorities voted against the law. After all, with the exception of the Liberals, they all had reason to fear further repression. The Anti-Socialist Law had 2 major purposes. For one, it aimed to unite the bourgeoisie under one common political economic bloc under Bismarck's leadership by stigmatizing the socialists. This endeavor was clearly successful. In 1879, the Reichstag passed a law which put protectionist tariffs on imported goods, something which large landowners and heavy industrialists had been unsuccessfully demanding for years. The Liberals, who had been advocating for a free trade market, had been intimidated and severely weakened. Secondly, the law aimed to completely crush not just the Socialist Workers' Party, but the workers' movement in general. It allowed the police of all German states to ban all organizations, assemblies and publications which aimed to overthrow the existing state and social order through social democratic, socialist or communist endeavors. The authorities were given extensive leeway to enforce the law, and they were particularly harsh in the social democratic strongholds such as Saxony and parts of Prussia. Not only did they dissolve all socialist organizations and associations, they also punished their officials, members and even landlords who had rented out rooms to them with a heavy fine or even imprisonment. Socialist books, newspapers and pamphlets were prohibited as well, and every print shop that continued to print them and every bookshop that sold them could be forcibly closed. In some jeopardized cities like Berlin, Hamburg and Leipzig, a minor state of siege was declared. This meant that the police could forbid any sort of public assembly if they felt like it, and expel anyone they identified as an agitator. The Social Democrats were outraged. In the month before the law was passed, August Bebel gave an inspiring and surprisingly prophetic speech in the Reichstag. "Do you know what you will do with the law? You will drive the Social Democrats, like the first Christians, to extreme zeal, even fanaticism, and to a formal religious fervour through the persecution you are inflicting on them. The workers, you may be sure, will stand up for their convictions with the utmost tenacity. They will do so in workshops, in factories, in the family and in the pub, on the railway, on walks on Sundays, and in many other places, where no one is able to control them." Initially, the anti-socialist law was a heavy blow against social democracy. In the Reichstag election of 1881, the party lost even more votes and many former members simply left. Some socialist politicians ceased their political activities or even emigrated abroad. It needs to be said, however, that the state repression wasn't this rigorous in all parts of Germany. In the traditionally liberal states of Baden and Württemberg, parts of Bavaria and in other regions, the authorities took a rather lenient approach. One very striking example of this is the region that encompasses the modern-day state of Thuringia. During the German Empire, it was still a patchwork of various principalities and duchies, with some parts being owned by Prussia. On the one hand, you had Erfurt, which was in every conceivable way a Prussian bulwark against social democracy, in which the police took a particularly hard line. The principalities of Schwarzburg-Rudolstadt and Schwarzburg-Sondershausen followed this example as well. On the other hand, you had the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which had voted for the Social Democrat Wilhelm Bock as the vice president of the regional parliament. During the 1880s, many Social Democrats from Erfurt and other parts of Thuringia regularly met up in Saxe-Coburg and Gotha because the freedom of the press and the freedom to organize were left untouched there. Despite continuing pressure from Prussia, the small duchy maintained its stance and allowed the meetings to happen. Otto von Bismarck was at the height of his power. He had eliminated the biggest opposition to the status quo. In his eyes, social democracy was merely a revolutionary and destructive force, with no redeeming characteristics. The Chancellor wanted to destroy the workers' movement as a whole, while it was still relatively young and small. The solidarity between the workers should be broken before social democracy could establish itself as the leading party of the proletariat. Bismarck wanted to provide an ideological alternative by uniting the very diverse population of the relatively young German Empire. The class conflict should be overcome, and all the industrialists, workers, intellectuals, aristocrats, Catholics, Protestants, South Germans and Prussians should all feel united as one single nation. It is no coincidence that Bismarck stopped his Kulturkampf against Catholics as soon as the anti-socialist repression began. The Catholics were a major group within Germany, and thus needed to be included in this national community. The socialists, with their internationalist worldviews, on the other hand, needed to be strictly excluded and removed from the public. Still, Bismarck couldn't ban the socialist movement and then simply continue to ignore the miserable work and living conditions of the working class. He wanted to give the workers a viable alternative and offer them a feeling of safety and material protection. Furthermore, he aimed to take the wind out of the sails of the Social Democrats and to undermine the workers' movement as a whole. And so, over the course of the following decade, he introduced a number of laws which gave the German workers the most extensive social system in the world and laid the foundation for the modern welfare state. In 1883, an obligatory health insurance under public law was introduced, which both employees and employers had to pay into. 1 year later, an accident insurance was introduced, and in 1889, the workers were blessed with an old age and disability insurance. Despite the very advanced and generous social legislation, the workers did not turn away from social democracy. After all, there was virtually no progress in workers' protection at the time, and exploitative working hours and child labour persisted. Bismarck was obviously not a philanthropist, and he opposed any reform that would have pitted the state against the interests of big industry and large landowners. The socialists were unprepared for the repression and initially struggled to find an appropriate response. Some believed that it was best to lay low, obey the laws, and to adapt to the new situation as quickly as possible. A pamphlet distributed by the social democratic politicians in the Reichstag concluded with the phrase, "Our enemies must perish because of our lawfulness." A small minority, however, called for fierce resistance and revolutionary violence. They were represented by Johann Most and Wilhelm Hasselmann. Hasselmann was a popular politician in the Reichstag who had worked as an editor at several social democratic newspapers. Most, on the other hand, was a radical, who despised parliamentarism and who had gotten into conflict with the authorities on multiple occasions. However, it was impossible to implement their idea of revolutionary resistance. The workers' movement was simply too small for that, and only a small fraction of workers unconditionally stood behind them. As a result of their aggressive behaviour, both Most and Hasselmann were excluded from the Social Democratic Party during the party congress in exile at Wüden Castle in Switzerland in 1880. Still, the Social Democrats knew that they couldn't exclusively stick to legal means, and during the Wüden Congress, the party made the decision to commit to both legal and illegal activities in the future. At the core of the legal activities were election campaigns and parliamentary work. This was possible because the German electorate directly voted for a representative for their constituency, which meant that well-known Social Democrats could still run for office and get elected. Simultaneously, the party began to organize the workers inside front organizations. These quickly began to appear in the traditional centers of social democracy, such as Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Saxony. In 1879, a training association for workers was founded in Leipzig, and just 1 year later, the local police noted that there were over 40 similar clubs with roughly 1,600 members. The socialists met in theatres and singing clubs, as well as in sport and literature associations. Despite the state repression, the number of members in the illegal party organizations and trade unions grew steadily. Pamphlets and magazines were produced abroad, especially in Switzerland and Britain, and then smuggled into Germany. The newspaper Der Sozialdemokrat was printed first in Zurich and later in London, and within just a few years it had reached thousands of readers. People came together to collect funds for fellow comrades who had been imprisoned or expelled. August Bebel described the time of repression as most unpleasant and as the most worrying years of his life. After the minor state of siege was declared over his hometown of Leipzig, he had been expelled and forced to live away from his wife and his child. When he took a walk along Brühl's terrace in Dresden in 1882, Bebel got arrested in front of his 13-year-old daughter for writing illegal pamphlets and then sent to prison for 4 months. His wife, Julie, became increasingly involved in party activities, took care of the payments, did the accounting, and paid out support to expelled members. While her husband was in prison, she became his deputy and took over his correspondence. She did an excellent job and asserted herself against many of her critics in this very male-dominated environment. Still, like other Social Democrats, she could not help to fall into pessimism when faced with the constant paranoia and repression. The reaction is in full bloom. You feel like you've been transported to the Middle Ages. It is as if all feeling and compassion for suffering humanity has died and we are going back to the way things were rather than moving forwards. August Bebel himself, who had always believed in cooperation, reform and a legal approach, became increasingly bitter. The fact that we had been expelled like vagabonds or criminals and torn from our wives and children without any legal proceedings was a mortal insult to me. No trial, no conviction has ever aroused similar feelings of hatred, bitterness and resentment in me. The anti-socialist laws led the social democratic movement to become radical. In the 1880s, it slowly abandoned its reformist and cooperative approach with the state and instead turned to Marxism. Now the final goal was the abolishment of the state and the redistribution of the means of production to the working class. This development coincided with the sudden publication of several of Karl Marx's unfinished writings in 1883. His close friend, Friedrich Engels, also published his own writing and thus helped in creating a coherent Marxist worldview. Still, despite the theoretical radicalization, the party mostly stuck to legal means in practice and refrained from carrying out sabotage, organizing large protests, or engaging in terrorism. It was also difficult to incite the workers to protest because strikes required a lot of effort to plan and harbored big risks such as being arrested or fired from the job. Voting for a social democratic candidate in secret Reichstag elections, however, was a risk-free way for people to show their allegiance to the workers' movement, and so the party kept focusing most of its effort in parliamentary activities and getting the people to vote for them. Despite the repression, the Socialist Workers' Party managed to gain increasing popularity, and in the Reichstag elections of 1887 it gained 10.1% of the votes. Towards the end of the 1880s, Otto von Bismarck came under increasing pressure. His strategy of curbing the social democratic movement with a carrot and stick policy, with social laws as the carrot and anti-socialist repression as the stick, was anything but successful. He refused to acknowledge the plight of the average person in the country, and to understand the different positions within the workers' movement. While his social laws were certainly a step in the right direction, he failed to see that the workers wanted actual factory laws to curb the exploitation and a drastic reduction of working hours. In his eyes, Social Democrats, Marxists and anarchists all belonged to the same group of revolutionaries who only wanted to stage a brutal civil war. Like the rest of the German public, he was caught by complete surprise when a great miners' strike broke out in May 1889. It was organised by the workers, who were upset about the fact that they had seen no increase in wages or a decrease in working hours despite the economic upturn in the preceding years. Thousands of miners put down their pickaxes in Lower and Upper Silesia, Saxony and the Saarland. The epicenter of the protest was the Ruhr Valley, where a staggering 90,000 men went on strike. It was the largest workers' strike Germany had ever seen. They demanded an improvement of work conditions, an 8-hour workday, and the election of workers' committees. The authorities responded by sending the military into the strike areas. In Bottrop and Bochum, clashes broke out between the workers and the military, which resulted in several deaths. Already in June of the same year, the strike ended without any significant accommodation on the part of the employers. Nevertheless, the strike was not without consequences. Textile workers, shoemakers, carpenters, bricklayers, woodworkers and many others increasingly began to organize themselves in trade unions, and the number of trade union members grew steadily. The workers who had previously voted predominantly for the Liberals or the Centre now turned to the Social Democrats. The The strike also showed that the workers' demands for better working conditions could not be suppressed by police measures. In 1890, Bismarck attempted to crack down on social democracy one final time. His anti-socialist laws had originally been limited to just a few years and were subsequently extended 4 times. The new law proposal, which was presented to the Reichstag, was even harsher than the previous ones. For one, it was supposed to be implemented permanently, and a new paragraph allowed the police to expel social democratic agitators from their hometown across Germany. The National Liberals, whose votes were needed to pass, didn't want to take responsibility for passing such an illiberal paragraph. They agreed to vote for the unlimited extension of the law under the condition that the paragraph be removed. Bismarck was furious and instructed the Conservative Party leaders to vote against the new proposal. He now wanted to suppress the workers' movement some other way without the anti-socialist law. As was to be expected, the Conservatives, Left Liberals, the Centre Party and the Social Democrats voted against the law in January 1890, and with that the period of repression was finally over. Bismarck never got the chance to bring his plan to an end. In the Reichstag elections of 1890, the Social Democrats gained 19.7% of the votes, and Bismarck's coalition of Conservatives and National Liberals shattered before his eyes. Furthermore, he had been on a confrontational course with the new emperor, Wilhelm II, who had risen to the throne in 1888 and who wanted to gain more power for himself. When Bismarck unexpectedly met with the leader of the Centre Party to discuss the formation of a new bloc and the reversal of some anti-Catholic laws, Wilhelm was furious at the Chancellor for not informing him about the meeting on time. On the insistence of the young Kaiser, Bismarck submitted his resignation letter in March 1890 and left his post as Chancellor of the German Empire after almost 20 years. The anti-socialist laws were Bismarck's greatest political failure alongside the Kulturkampf. Not only did they contribute massively to his own personal downfall, they also made the workers' movement more radical and paved the way for a social democratic mass movement. In the last election of the German Empire before the outbreak of World War I, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, as the party now called itself, gained 34.8% of the votes. Even after it had ended, the repression of the socialists had long-lasting effects. Even though Bismarck's laws were relatively harmless compared to other forms of anti-socialist violence exercised in other countries, the brutal crackdown of the Paris Commune and the Haymarket affair in the US being just a few prominent examples, they still had a long-lasting impact. The decade-long suppression and exclusion from society by the state, military, churches and civil society was a deeply traumatic experience, and it increased the solidarity among the Social Democrats. Any sort of cooperation with the state was now out of the question, and many socialists saw themselves in a never-ending struggle between them and the antagonistic bourgeois society. The Social Democrats expected the collapse of the capitalist society in a timely manner. Until the death of August Bebel, the party waited for the revolution to happen, but ultimately refrained from committing any revolutionary activities themselves. This trauma came to light in summer of 1914 and led the majority of Social Democratic members of Parliament to make one of the most fateful decisions in German history. Even though the Social Democrats had organised pacifist demonstrations and called for international solidarity, the party still voted unanimously in favour of war credits and openly supported the German war effort. They did this for 2 reasons. First, they fell for the official propaganda, which portrayed the German entry into the Great War as purely defensive. Secondly, they no longer wanted to be perceived as anti-patriotic traitors who abandoned their fatherland in the hour of need. After the horrors of the war became apparent, the Social Democratic unity began to wither, and in 1917 the party split in 2. The Social Democratic Party would face another, much more brutal period of suppression under the National Socialists shortly after their complete seizure of power. Before that, the Social Democratic Party was the only party which opposed the Enabling Act of 1933, which granted the cabinet and the Chancellor Adolf Hitler the power to make laws without the involvement of the parliament. The party leader, Otto Wels, gave a brave and resilient speech in which he defended the successes of Weimar democracy and referred to Bismarck's anti-social laws as a source of inspiration. In this historic hour, we German Social Democrats solemnly declare our commitment to the principles of humanity and justice, freedom and socialism. No enabling act gives you the power to destroy ideas that are eternal and indestructible. The socialist law did not destroy social democracy. German social democracy can also draw new strength from new persecutions. We salute the persecuted and the oppressed. We greet our friends in the Reich. Their steadfastness and loyalty deserves our admiration. Their courage of conviction, their unbroken confidence guarantee a brighter future. Despite the harsh repression and ideological struggles it faced in the 1880s, the social democratic movement in Germany ultimately emerged stronger, evolving from a persecuted underground organization into a significant political force. Looking back on the anti-socialist laws, Bismarck's failure united and radicalized the movement, while subsequent political challenges shaped its evolving identity. Even after enduring setbacks during both world wars and under National Socialist rule, the Social Democratic Party remained a resilient advocate for workers' rights and social justice, leaving a lasting legacy in German political history. For the most part, at least. Okay then, dankeschön for watching until the end. As you probably know, making these videos is incredibly time consuming, so if you want to make sure that I make more of them, please consider supporting me on Patreon. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon exclusive Discord server, and depending on your tier, a number of other sweet benefits. In any case, I want to thank my invaluable supporters, without whom this wouldn't be possible. Marius Gerling, Ian York, Leader Titan, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Philip Marchewka, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wienweh, Pseudoriser, Lyle Furphy, Yin, William, Big Dave, Folling and Turdham Bone. Have a very nice day and see you next time.